Picture a cup of coffee with cream just poured in. At first, you have two clean layers, easy to describe. Hours later, you have a uniform brown mixture, also easy to describe. But somewhere in between, when tendrils of cream are swirling through the coffee in intricate fractal patterns, the system looks genuinely complicated. Entropy, we know, just marches upward the whole time. But complexity, whatever that really means, seems to rise and then fall. Our universe appears to do the same thing on a cosmic scale, starting as a featureless hot plasma, passing through an era of galaxies and planets and brains, and eventually dispersing into a thin, cold soup after the black holes evaporate. The question this paper takes on is whether we can pin down that rise and fall pattern mathematically in even a toy system. The challenge is that the obvious mathematical measures of disorder don't capture what we mean by complexity. Boltzmann entropy, Gibbs entropy, Shannon entropy, and Kolmogorov complexity all behave roughly the same way for our purposes. They assign high values to random, featureless states. Kolmogorov complexity, in particular, is the length of the shortest computer program that outputs a given string. And a fully mixed random-looking coffee cup would have very high Kolmogorov complexity because there's no pattern to compress. That's the opposite of what we want. We want a measure that's small for the initial layered state, small for the final mixed state, and large only for the interesting middle. The authors survey 4 candidate complexity measures. The first is apparent complexity, which is just the entropy of a smoothed or blurred version of the state. The intuition is that blurring averages out random noise, so a fully mixed cup blurs to a uniform gray with very little information, while a swirly intermediate state retains visible structure even after blurring. The second is sophistication, an idea from Kolmogorov himself, which tries to separate the non-random part of a description from the random part by finding the smallest set that contains your object as a generic member. The third is logical depth, due to Charles Bennett, which measures how long the shortest program takes to run rather than how long it is. The idea being that genuinely interesting objects take real computational work to produce. The fourth is light cone complexity, which measures the mutual information between the past and future of a point in space-time. Each of these has problems. Sophistication is not just uncomputable, but provably stays small for any system generated by a short, probabilistic program, which means it would never become large for the coffee cup, killing the whole experiment. Logical depth is even harder to estimate in practice. Light cone complexity requires knowing the full causal history, so the authors settle on apparent complexity, essentially because it's the only one they can actually compute. The trick is to approximate Kolmogorov complexity using a real compression program like gzip. The size of the gzipped file gives you an upper bound on the true Kolmogorov complexity. Now to the experiment itself. They build a two-dimensional cellular automaton on a grid. Ones represent cream particles, zeros represent coffee. The grid starts with cream on top and coffee on the bottom. They study 2 variants. In the interacting version, 2 adjacent cells with different values swap at each step, so particles physically displace each other and only one particle can occupy a cell. In the non-interacting version, each cream particle independently random walks through the coffee, and multiple cream particles can pile up in the same cell. The non-interacting version is easier to analyze mathematically because each particle is independent, but it's less physically realistic. To measure apparent complexity, they coarse-grain the grid by averaging cells inside small square windows, then threshold those averages into a handful of discrete levels. Think of it as the view from a few feet away, where you see regions of mostly cream, mostly coffee, or mixed. The gzipped file size of this coarse-grained image is their estimate of complexity. The gzipped file size of the original fine-grained image is their estimate of entropy. The analogy here is photographing the cup at 2 resolutions. The high-resolution photo keeps accumulating random information forever, But the low-resolution photo first develops visible swirls and then washes out to uniform gray. The results show exactly the rise and fall pattern they hoped for, at least in the interacting case. Entropy climbs monotonically. Complexity rises, peaks, and falls back down. They also study how the peak scales with grid size. The peak entropy grows quadratically with the side length, which makes sense because it's proportional to the total number of particles. The peak complexity grows only linearly with the side length, suggesting that the interesting structure develops essentially along one dimension, the moving boundary between cream and coffee. And the time to reach peak complexity scales quadratically with grid size, matching the diffusion time for particles to find their configurations. There's a subtle issue, though. When they first ran the experiment, the non-interacting model also showed a complexity peak, which was surprising because theoretically it shouldn't. The authors traced this to an artifact of thresholding. When a smooth gradient gets sliced into discrete levels, small random fluctuations near the boundaries between levels create spurious flickering that compression algorithms see as structure. They fixed this with an adjustment step that lets each coarse-grained cell shift by one threshold level if doing so improves compression, with a heuristic that snaps cells toward the majority value in their row. After this fix, the non-interacting automaton's complexity stays low throughout, while the interacting one still shows a clear peak. This is the key empirical claim. Interactions are what make complexity possible. The authors back this up with a proof for the non-interacting case. Using a Chernoff bound, they show that as long as the coarse-graining window is large enough, roughly the square root of the logarithm of the grid size, the actual particle counts in each window stay close to their expected values with high probability. And those expected values depend only on the vertical position and time by symmetry. So you can describe the entire coarse-grained state with just the grid size and the time step, meaning its Kolmogorov complexity is essentially logarithmic. The non-interacting system literally cannot become complex at the coarse-grained level. Proving the analogous statement for the interacting case, that complexity provably does become large, they leave as an open problem. The honest limitations here are substantial. Apparent complexity depends on the choice of smoothing function, which carries some arbitrariness. Gzip is a stand-in for true Kolmogorov complexity and only gives upper bounds, not lower bounds. So even when complexity appears to peak, you haven't strictly proven the system isn't secretly simpler. To actually prove a system becomes complex at intermediate times, you'd need lower bounds on Kolmogorov complexity, which is notoriously hard. And the cellular automaton is a toy. Extrapolating from coffee in a two-dimensional grid to the entropy and complexity of the cosmos is suggestive, not rigorous. But as a first quantitative foothold on a question that's mostly lived in informal hand-waving, it's a genuine contribution. Now let's walk through some questions you might have after hearing all of this. Why does coarse graining make a random, mixed state look simple when its raw Kolmogorov complexity is enormous? The raw mixed state has high Kolmogorov complexity precisely because the exact positions of particles are random and uncompressible. But the coarse-grained view averages over those local randomness details, so what survives is just uniform gray everywhere, which compresses down to almost nothing. The smoothing function is acting like a filter that throws away incidental randomness and keeps only macroscopic structure, which is exactly what our intuition about complexity tracks. Why does interaction matter so much for complexity to emerge? In the non-interacting model, each cream particle wanders independently, so by symmetry and the law of large numbers, the coarse-grained density at each point is essentially determined by a simple formula involving position and time. There's no room for contingent, history-dependent structure. With interactions, particles block each other, which creates sharp boundaries, fingering instabilities, and tendrils whose exact shape depends on the random history. Those contingent structures are what coarse-graining preserves and what makes the system genuinely hard to describe at intermediate times. Why couldn't they just use sophistication, since that's the conceptually cleanest measure? Sophistication has a deep theoretical problem for this kind of experiment. Any state produced by a short probabilistic program, and the coffee automaton is exactly that, a simple rule with random choices, provably has low sophistication with high probability. You can describe such a state as a generic sample from the set of likely outputs, and that description is short. So even if you could compute sophistication, it would never spike for the coffee cup. This is why the authors fall back on apparent complexity, which is less elegant but actually responsive to the structures we care about. For large-scale recommendation systems, the rise and fall framing maps onto something concrete. The diversity and structure of a user's interest profile evolves in a similar pattern over their life cycle on a platform. A brand new user has a simple, low-complexity profile. A long-tenured power user who is engaged with everything has a profile that's so diffuse it's also effectively simple. High entropy, low structure, hard to personalize against. The genuinely valuable users for ranking are in the middle, where their interests have developed contingent, idiosyncratic structure that a coarse-grained embedding can actually capture. This suggests instrumenting user representations with something like an apparent complexity signal. For instance, compressing a coarse-grained version of a user's interaction history and tracking how that compressed size evolves, as a way to detect which users are in the high information regime where personalization pays off most. More broadly, the distinction between interacting and non-interacting dynamics is a useful lens on candidate retrieval and ranking. Independent item-level scoring is the non-interacting model and tends to produce homogeneous, low-complexity slates. Real engagement comes from interactions, diversity constraints, sequential context, items that displace each other in the slate, which is what generates the rich contingent structure users actually find interesting. The paper's empirical finding that interactions are what enable complexity to emerge is a nice theoretical anchor for why list-wise and sequence-aware ranking objectives consistently outperform pure point-wise scoring in production systems.